I have to be honest with you, the subjects of our lessons today and probably next week as well may seem a little out of place. How many of you say, I had a great Christmas, I'm sad to see it go? How many say, I'm glad it's over with? Probably if we don't celebrate it the right way, that'll happen. But when I was preparing for this, these lessons, in fact, I met with Pastor Joel and I said, I'd like to take some personalities and take people that correspond to the Christmas story. I should have taken the time. I knew that, and we all do from years of experience, that there are either 4 or 5 Sundays in any month, in any year, 4 or 5. And I should have taken the time to pull out a calendar and see how many Sundays there were in December of this year. But I thought, well, if there could be 5, let's do 5 lessons that center around the central figures of the Christmas narrative. And so I did that. 3 of them fell before Christmas, and Christmas is already over. For those of you who wish you could have more Christmas in your year, you're going to get some for the next 2 Sunday school lessons, because I'm going to discuss Elisabeth and Zacharias today. And then next week, even though it's going to be after the first of the year, we're going to jump into Simeon and Anna, who are not married, but as you'll see, or if you know about them, we'll look at their lives. And then we'll go back in somewhat a normal plan and finish this up in a couple months. But anyway, these series of lessons on individuals are tremendously helpful. Some of you have maybe been or thought about going to the Holy Land. I know there's a lot of unrest in the Middle East, and sometimes for Americans traveling abroad in that area, there's some concerns for safety and so forth. But I always thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to go to the same places that we've been reading about in the Bible for years? Wouldn't it be great to go to the very spot where Moses parted the Red Sea and stand there looking there, imagining the waters parting, or sitting on the grassy hillside where Jesus fed the 5,000? Or going to the location where Jesus ascended. And some of these places, we know the exact location of many of these historical narratives and stories that we read about. Some of them are speculative, and some are flat out incorrect. They've attributed places and events that really didn't take place there. But, I would love to go back in time. When I was a kid, I saw a movie on television called The Time Machine, based upon the story by Orson Welles. And it fascinated me. How many of you saw that old movie, years ago? Our older people know it. It was a classic movie. And in fact, so many years went by and I hadn't seen it, and I was, something prompted my thinking. I don't know if Pastor Joe remembers this, probably 15 years ago or so. I said, this movie is great. And back then, all the technology was passing me by. It was just racing past me, and I wasn't willing to chase after. I just let it go, and it's still been running ahead of me. But he said, I can get you that movie. I'm sure I could find that movie and get you that movie in a couple of days. I said, no, you can't do that. He got out his phone. I don't remember that day, Lisa. He got in his phone, and in just a matter of seconds, he found a used copy of that movie in a DVD. And it arrived at my house a few days later. I've never forgotten that. I thought technology, there's some benefits of technology. So I have the movie if any of you want to borrow it. But he gets in this machine, he goes back in time, he just picks a period of time, and he's narrating his experiences as he's watching, his life go back. And it's a fascinating sci-fi movie. And if I had a machine like that, I tell you what I do. I would most definitely go back to the times of Christ. And I would meet some of these characters that we're learning about in this Sunday school series. And I have a lot of questions for them that I want to ask them, or just get to know them on a more personal level. Because I've really enjoyed a study like this. So we're going to pick it up in Luke 1. And we'll be looking at a couple of other passages here in a minute. But let's pick it up in verse 5. Again, we're discussing Zacharias and Elisabeth, a couple who would be the parents of who? John the Baptist. There was in the days of Herod, king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias of the course of Abiah, and his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elisabeth. It was not uncommon in those days for people not only to marry within the same race. Hebrews primarily married other Hebrews, but very often they would also marry within the same tribe of the 12 tribes. And the reason that precedent was set was because in the early days when the land was divided among the 12 tribes, they would keep their inheritance, which was mostly property, mostly land. And they wanted those land areas divided up, throughout the region to be kept within that tribe. So that happened here in this case with Zacharias and Elisabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blameless. And they had no child because that Elisabeth was barren, and they both were now well stricken in years. And it came to pass that while he, Zacharias, executed the priest's office before God in the order of his course, according to the custom of the priest's office, his lot was to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord. That's the holy place as we know it. And the whole multitude of the people were praying without at the time of incense. And there appeared unto him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And when Zacharias saw him, he was troubled, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said unto him, Fear not, Zacharias, for thy prayer is heard, and thy wife Elisabeth shall bear a son, and thou shalt call his name John. So that's kind of the precedent for the lesson. It begins in verse number 5 with a reference to the king of Israel at that time, was a man named Herod. We, of course, know that he was also referred to as Herod the Great. That was not a reflection on his character, quite the opposite. He did do some amazing things as a political leader, but by the time his reign ended and he died, he was rather paranoid, and he was distrustful of everybody, his advisors, even his closest family members. He had many of them killed. He was a brutal, arrogant, ungodly man, but he was the king of the Jews. And he was the man that was in charge when John and Elisabeth come on the scene in the biblical narrative. In fact, it was near the end of his reign that he came on the scene. It's interesting, Luke's gospel, unlike the other three gospels, is a good connection between the Old Testament and the New. Without looking, what is the last book of the Old Testament? Malachi. Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, prophesies about someone who would come, who would be the forerunner or the one preparing the way of the Lord. And that's in chapter 3, verse number 1. It's speaking about a messenger who would come and prepare the way of the Lord. In the very last words of the Old Testament, and if you want to turn there, you can, but in Malachi chapter number 4 and verse 5, it says, Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet. I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. Those are the very last words we read about in the Old Testament. And most of you know there was a period where there were no other books of the Bible authored or inspired until we get to the New Testament. Some of you may remember this. How many years, we call it years of silence? Who said? 400. 400 years where God didn't speak to his people through his writings. But it's interesting that the book of Malachi was written about 397 BC. Elijah, who's referenced there in the next to last verse of the book of Malachi, Elijah ministered around 900 BC. So Elijah had long since been born, grew up, lived, performed his ministry. He was God's spokesman. Many of the great stories we read about in 1st and 2nd Kings and about the great period of the prophets and all the miracles that Elijah did, and some of the most notable miracles of all occurred in the life of Elijah. All those happened 500 years earlier. I mean, and yet it says there, I will send you Elijah the prophet. So we're saying, how can this be? Elijah had long since lived and died. Well, there's two things that come into play here. One of them is Elijah didn't experience a normal death. Elijah was taken up in a fiery chariot. And the other thing is, we know from reading the New Testament, now that you're familiar with the New Testament, that this prophecy given here at the end of Malachi about Elijah coming, this messenger Elijah coming to prepare the way of the Lord, was fulfilled in the person of whom? John the Baptist. So Luke does a good job of connecting the Old Testament and the New Testament by going back. The first early verses in the Gospel of Luke reference not the coming of Jesus Christ, but rather the birth of John the Baptist, who would be the forerunner, and specifically about his parents, Zacharias and Elisabeth. So that's what the lesson is about today. If you're taking notes, I have 3 simple points. First of all, we want to see the promise of the righteous couple. And that again is found in verses 5 through 7. The promise to a righteous couple. When this passage makes reference to Herod the Great, again, it is a time of upheaval in the nation. It's safe to say that the Jews distrusted their government. They were tired of Roman oppression. They knew that Herod the Great was often a puppet for the Roman government, and he was complicit to the taxes and the laws that were put in place. He wasn't defending their rights as God's people and their role as God's people. He was not liked at all. The people generally disdain him. And this is the climate in which Elisabeth and Zacharias come on the scene. They're given an explanation about their character in verse number 6. 2 words stand out in that verse that are worth looking at. One is the word blameless, and the other is righteous. In verse 6, they were righteous before God, and they were, at the last word there, blameless. That does not mean that they were without fault or without sin. That just meant that they were godly people who were faithful to the Lord during a very dark time, a time of silence that Brother Ernie's referring to, that 400 years where God didn't speak to his people. There were no prophets. There were no inspired writings. Things were not going well, and it went on for a long period of time. The people alive during Elisabeth and Zacharias' day knew very little about God's plan for mankind, and only a certain select individuals studied the scriptures wanted to know that someone was going to be coming soon to bring salvation to God's people. It was just a time of, they were floundering spiritually. They were just trying to survive. And yet this couple comes on the scene, and they're a godly couple. And it says something to us about how we live our lives. We all have different opportunities, different talents, different abilities, and God will use us all, each in our own unique way. But here's one thing we can all, and we should all be. We should all be faithful. We should just be faithful. This is just a couple. They were faithful. They were both from a priestly tribe, and so they used their lives to serve the Lord the best they could. And in the case of Zacharias, he had the title of a priest. He served as a priest. Some of you may forget that. If I asked you before we started this lesson, what was the occupation of John the Baptist's father? Many of us wouldn't connect those dots and say, oh, he was a priest. We forget that about Zacharias. And he's performing his duties in the temple. There was a schedule, I guess, like our usher schedule, where he would go and perform the duty of burning the incense, which was in itself a very honorable thing to do. And it was a privilege for the men to go in at their allotted time and perform their duties in the temple. While he was there, he was confronted by an angel. I think sometimes our impressions of angels are a little less than accurate. We can thank Hollywood for a lot of that. I think the image of a glowing figure with white robes and big wings and all of that, long flowing hair and all that, maybe a little bit less than accurate. I guess an angel can come in many different forms, but I know this, and so do you, that in the Bible, sometimes angels appeared to people and people did not even distinguish them from normal people. They look like human beings. And although there are descriptions of angels as it relates to the Ark of the Covenant having wings and so forth, I don't know if we actually have or will come in contact with a legitimate angel these days. I don't think I'm just speculating that they won't have big white wings and they won't be flying around with wings. An angel today would probably look a lot like my wife, actually, if you want to know. That should earn me some points for something. I don't know what we're having for dinner tonight, honey, but it better be good after that comment. I think they look like, oftentimes came in normal. In fact, when they came, it wasn't like, oh, how cute, an angel. Maybe it's my guardian angel. No, if you look at the response of people in the Bible, certainly Zacharias here, he feared what he saw. He was afraid when this angel suddenly appeared to him in this particular setting. And, this angel gives him a message in verse number 13, thy prayer is heard. What prayer? Well, we assume, rightly or wrongly, that the prayer that Zacharias had been giving to God over the years was a prayer for a child, because the Bible tells us they were not able to have children. But it doesn't say specifically that was the prayer that was answered. But if it is, you'll notice at the end of verse number 7, we don't know exactly what the age is here, but we know that they are well stricken in years. If the prayer that the angel is referring to here is that your prayer is going to be answered, and the prayer, it seems in the context of this passage, it could very well be his prayers for a child. It says one of two things. Either he stopped praying years ago for a child because now they were at the age where a conception and birth would be a miracle, or he continued to pray. Either way, it demonstrates a tremendous amount of faith on the part of Zacharias and Elisabeth. And I just want to challenge you with this thought today. Could it be that you have prayed, or you are praying for something now, that God will not immediately answer? But God doesn't have an expiration date on your prayers. God doesn't say, well, I remember you prayed that for me, but that was a long time ago, so that got taken off the list now. Either their fervent prayers for a child occurred years before. Now that they were well up in years, they may have stopped praying for a child because, practically speaking, they could not have children. And physically speaking, who wants to be that old and have to go through the trouble of raising a little baby? I don't have the energy sometimes to take care of myself. I can't imagine. My wife said years ago that God gives children to the young because when you get older, you don't have the energy to keep up with them. And even when you're young, it's a challenge sometimes to keep up with them. I don't know if they're still praying for a child, which shows great faith, or whether their faithful prayers that may have happened years before are only now being realized and answered. Either way you look at it, if his prayer was for a child, and that's the prayer that God was going to grant, it speaks volumes about his faith here in this setting. And the Bible goes on to explain not only that they would have a child, but what the role of that child would be. So I want you to know, secondly, blessings on an elderly couple. Now look down to verse number 24. After those days, his wife Elisabeth conceived and hid herself 5 months, saying, thus hath the Lord dealt with me in the days wherein he looked on me to take away my reproach among men. Just as God had promised, Elisabeth did conceive a child. Interesting, Elisabeth, the name Elisabeth means God is an oath, or in other words, you can say it this way, God will keep his promises to us. That's what her name means. It's almost prophetic that she was named Elisabeth. And Luke goes on to say that Elisabeth would stay out of sight for a long time, a period of about 5 months, before she revealed to anybody in the community that she was expecting a child. Now, I want to say some things about that. We have a similar situation. We looked at Mary and her reasoning behind, keeping her pregnancy a matter of secrecy because she was not married yet to Joseph, and there were other implications. This is not that situation. Zacharias and Elisabeth not only were married, but they had been married for a long time, and the people in the community probably knew that she was expecting a child. I don't know her exact reasons for staying away and not revealing the fact that she was with child until 5 months later. It could be, I'm going to speculate, it could be that this would bring a lot of attention upon her. This, as you recall, this is a miraculous birth. She's well up in years. We don't know exactly how old she is, but this would bring a lot of perhaps unwanted attention on her. People would say, well, this is a miracle. And maybe the news would get around and she'd been bombarded with people. I don't know. Maybe she just wanted some time to reflect upon things. You know, maybe she was hopeful in her heart, but wondering, is this really going to be? Is this really going to happen here? Remember, the message was given to her husband, Zacharias, and we learn from the intermediary verses that when Zacharias heard that message from the angel, he was stricken with, he was a mute. He could not speak because he doubted the message that he had heard. That's in verse 20. Behold, thou shalt be dumb and not be able to speak until the day that these things shall be performed, because thou believest not my words, and shall be fulfilled. So, lest we're too hard on Zacharias and Elisabeth, if we never had children and then suddenly we're well up in years, we were told by an angel we're going to have a child. Zacharias doubted that. We have no reason to believe that. Elisabeth was also wondering, is this really going to happen? It could be, and I'm speculating, it could be that before she revealed this great news and this wonderful miracle to others, she wanted to make sure that she was showing. There was physical evidence that she was expecting a child. And, that would put all the doubters, silence all of her doubters that this indeed was happening. I don't know. We're not told why, but for some reason, she hid herself away for 5 months, the first 5 months of her pregnancy, and didn't reveal that to others. And, I guess we can take anything from that. There was a sense of, it's consistent with her character as being blameless and righteous. There was a thoughtfulness that went into this whole process. She's just going around town and blabbing it out. Hey, an angel came to my husband, and I'm going to have a child. Look at me. Look at me. I'm special. I'm a miracle mother. We'll sign books out front of Walmart, next week, and it wasn't that kind of thing. She did quite the opposite. She was very discreet. She was very humble about this miraculous event in her life. And there's a plan. There's a process that God takes any couple or mother through in the course of bringing a child into this world that we may have lost some of this today. There's a sense in which every child is a gift from God. And God has a plan and purpose for every child born. And it is nothing to be taken lightly. I think I don't have to go and rehearse all the things. People do not hold the same value to life, certainly the life of an unborn baby, as would have been the case back with Zacharias and Elisabeth during that day. It was a wonderful, humbling experience to go through this. And so she just pondered, just like Mary pondered things in her heart. She took some time to reflect and prepare and to think about the plan that God had, and as disclosed to John. And John, for his part, was running around with a chalkboard for the next several months because he was not able to speak. And, Daniel, having gone through that experience myself for a little bit, I can imagine that'd be a little frustrating. Daniel and I share a secret. There was a short time that my words weren't coming out exactly right, and only Daniel knew that. I don't know how he knew that. Maybe Daniel was a prophet, but when I disclosed that problem to my wife, she laughed at me, but Daniel sympathized with me. There's a difference there. She thought I was teasing her and joking with her, but I can just speak from experience. When you can't talk, especially someone like me, that's burdensome right there, when you can't say what you want to say. Can you imagine this guy walking around with a chalkboard for 9 months or whatever months it is and writing down the messages, I guess there's a lesson in that for us not to doubt God's word when he reveals his plan for us. But let me get to that last point. Obedience from a blessed couple. I want you to jump down now to verse number 59 of the same chapter, Luke chapter 1. It says, and it came to pass that on the 8th day they came to circumcise the child. So John had already been born, and they called him Zacharias. That was the name the people, the extended family, called him after the name of his father. And his mother answered and said, not so, but he shall be called John. And they said unto her, there's none of thy kindred that is called by this name. And they made signs to his father, because of course he couldn't speak, how he would have him called. And he asked for a writing table and wrote, saying, his name is John. And they marveled all. And Zacharias' mouth was open immediately, and his tongue loosed, and he spake and praised God. So according to the Jewish law, a boy child that was born would have to be circumcised the 8th day following his birth. It was often the time that they would also pronounce and give that child a name. Probably because Abraham received a new name when he was circumcised in his initial experience as a sign of the covenant God had with his people. His name, he was given a new name. So they often reserved that time. I suppose they didn't have gender reveal things. They didn't have technology and science like we do now. So when a child was born back then, they didn't know if it was going to be a boy or a girl. They didn't know if it'd be 1 or 2 or 3 or more. They just wait and saw when the child was born. They knew, and they had time to think about it and reflect. I'm sure parents and mothers got together and thought about a name for their children before the actual day. But we in our modern era ascribe names to our children in the hospital the day that they're born, or shortly thereafter. They waited 8 days. That was the day that a male child was circumcised, and they would give a name. And the people assumed that they would name this little boy Zacharias because that was the name of his father. And that culture is very common. Even if the child didn't receive the name of his father, then it was, secondly, most likely he'd be named after his grandfather. Let me say that again. Grandfather. And then it could be even further down the line. But they would often name a boy after one of the relatives of the father, mother, and particularly with a boy, be after the name of his father. So when Elisabeth said, we're going to name him John, they said, John? You don't have any relatives named John? And, they knew that old Zacharias was having trouble talking to people, but they wanted to get some kind of confirmation. They probably thought, we'll check with the boy's dad and get the straight scoop. And he said the same thing. We're going to name him. In fact, when they said, we're going to name the child Zacharias, the Bible says that she said, not so. The wording there doesn't really give us the emotion behind it. The expression there given in the New Testament, when she said, we're going to name the child Zacharias, right? And she said, not so. It'd be similar to us saying this. Absolutely not. What? What? Let's check with his father, Elisabeth's too emotional or something. I don't know what do you mean you reckon name the child Zacharias? And of course, when they conferred with his father, they did name the child Zacharias, John, and Zacharias immediately received his speech. And I love the first thing that comes out of his mouth when he hasn't been able to speak for 9 months. Mine might have been, I want a filet of fish sandwich from McDonald's, or where's the Rocky Road ice cream, or something like that. The first words out of his mouth when he could finally speak again were words of praise to God. I think that reinforces the character of this godly couple. And of course, there would be a special calling upon their son's life, and he would do great things in preparing the way for the Lord in the spirit of Elijah. Miliana, you ready to go to work for me again? You got a haircut. You're looking sharp, man. You handsome dog. Could you come help me pass these outlines out, if you would, please? Thank you, sir. Some of the things I referred to already, but let's cover some of these points, some of which I did not cover, just by way of review. We already mentioned that they came from a religious bloodline, from the tribe of Levi. They were both described as not only righteous before God, but blameless. And Zacharias in particular had the role and responsibility of being one of the priests in that small, tight-knit community. He was a man that was looked up and respected in his calling. Their names have great significance. I think I already referred to Elisabeth's name. It meant God is my oath, or God keeps his promises. Zacharias, for his part, his name means the Lord remembers. That's interesting. These are the Hebrew names. So these names were given to them before the narrative of John the Baptist's coming. This is interesting. Zacharias meant the Lord remembers, as in the Lord remembered your prayers. And Elisabeth, God is my oath. God keeps his promises. In a sense, it could be concluded today that their names were prophetic. The names given to them as children would come to be fulfilled in the narrative of John the Baptist. While in the temple, Zacharias was confronted by an angel, probably the angel Gabriel, came and said his prayers had been answered and they would have a child. And they would also, the angel would disclose the fact that God would have a special role and plan for their child. He was a miraculous child after all, and that would be revealed in his role as the forerunner of Jesus Christ. When Zacharias expressed his doubts about having a child in his old age, he was not able to speak for a season. And can you imagine explaining that when he came out of the temple and couldn't even talk? The people probably attributed that to some form of supernatural reaction. However, it was probably looked at more in lines of, what did you do wrong? Rather than what blessing has been imparted on your life. It's probably like, how'd you mess up in there, man? You did something wrong. You shouldn't have done that. After Elisabeth discovered that she was expecting, she hid herself away for 5 months. The biblical context says that she did so because God had taken away her reproach. So maybe there's something in line of her thoughtfulness, reflectiveness. Maybe it was just relief or overwhelming joy, whatever the reasons behind it. She decided not to disclose to the other people in the community that she was expecting a miraculous child for 5 months. During Elizabeth's 6-month pregnancy, she was visited by her cousin Mary. We looked at that when we discussed Mary and Joseph, who was also expecting a child on her own. And you remember that setting where when Mary came into the home of Elisabeth, the babe, John the Baptist, leapt in her womb. Again, there's all these signs, there's supernatural signs that God not only had a special role, of course, for Jesus, our Messiah and Savior, he also had a very special role for John the Baptist. And Elisabeth, of course, blessed Mary and her unborn child. Their son's name was chosen by God himself. Again, it wasn't Zacharias or another relative. It was God's calling. And this last point I put in there, I try to put sometimes we're curious, what eventually happened. In some cases, we have a biblical description of how the person passed from this life. In some cases, we have traditions or things that historians wrote about that can or cannot be completely trustworthy. I don't put a lot of credence or confidence in this particular one, but I did throw it in there just in case. One tradition holds that to the belief that Zacharias was killed by King Herod for refusing to disclose the whereabouts of his son John during the massacre of the innocents, because he would have fit into that age group as well. We have no biblical evidence and sparse historical evidence. I think sometimes people, in an effort to fill in the gaps between some of these great Bible figures and what happened with their lives, including how they died, they just make up traditions and stories. I would put an asterisk by that one and say maybe not. We don't know how John the Baptist's parents died. Maybe they lived out their lives naturally and died of natural causes. They were up in years. The Bible doesn't say anything more about their lives and ministry and influence following these early days when John came on the scene. So I guess you're going to have to wait till you get to heaven to ask them those questions. And if it's not too personal, you can say, hey, Zacharias, how did you die? He's going to say, Alan, why do you want to know that? I'm just curious. I want to know how you died. I don't know if that would be an uncomfortable and awkward question to ask of him. But we do not know, basically. If any of you have any other insights as to their deaths, you're more than welcome to pass it on. We'll share it with the class next Sunday. So next week we're going to look at Simeon and Anna, who were instrumental in the Christmas narrative, and then we'll go on to some other figures. I'm going to quickly go to the 12 or 13, if I throw Paul in there, apostles. We're going to jump into those on the tail end of this study. We're going to look at one half an hour condensed studies on the life of the apostles and things about them, and bring out some information that maybe we didn't know about them, including how they died, and then we'll go on to something else in the spring. Amen? It's going to be Christmas again next Sunday in Sunday school for one more week, so we'll enjoy that.